figuring out that there was a character in the DC universe called Aqualad, and I was like, oh man. You know, like Aqua by itself is dumb, but when you add the word lad to it, that is just too stupid to be like a superhero name. This dorkiness bled onto Superman. Again, even though my very first comic was a Superman comic, I was not a Superman fan when I was a little kid. This changed though, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about why this changed. So back to this Clan of the Fiery Cross storyline from the 1946 Superman radio show. After DC said yes to this, I was very happy, but I was also kind of freaked out. I felt like I really need to do my homework about this. You know, this is a historic Superman comic or Superman story. If I'm going to adapt it, I have to know something about the time period. I have to know something about the history. So I looked into it, and I'd like to share with you all what I learned. So the antagonists of this storyline, the Clan of the Fiery Cross, are basically the DC Universe version of the real-life Ku Klux Klan. The KKK was actually founded right at the end of the Civil War. You all know this, right, from your high school history books. It was founded by a group of men in Tennessee. They were freaked out that these newly freed African Americans were going to start demanding civil rights. We're going to start demanding equal rights. So they founded the Klan to make sure that the African Americans remain second-class citizens, and they mounted on a campaign of terror. They lynched, they burned down churches, they murdered African Americans and their white allies. They went through not just Tennessee, but all of the South. All this stuff I knew from my high school history class. Here's the part I didn't know. While this was happening, newspapers all over America were reporting on the activities of the Klan. And racists right here in California read these Klan articles, and they felt inspired. So back then in the 1800s, there weren't a lot of African Americans living in California yet, but there were a lot of Chinese immigrant workers. So these racists in California, they were worried that if African Americans started demanding equal rights in the South, that Chinese immigrants would do the same thing in the West. So they basically stole everything from the Southern Klan. They stole their costume, they stole their techniques, and they also began mounting on this reign of terror, this campaign of terror. They did the exact same things. They lynched, they burned down churches, they murdered Chinese immigrants and their white allies. So by the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, all of this terrorism actually really worked. So both in the South and here in the West, the African Americans and the Chinese immigrants felt kind of too scared to do anything. They also put in Jim Crow laws in the South and the Chinese Exclusion Act in the West. So even legally, both of these communities were kept down. Because of this, the Klan no longer felt threatened, so they started disappearing. Membership dropped, and they would have disappeared completely except for a story. This is how powerful stories are, right? In 1915, a movie comes out called The Birth of a Nation. And this is basically America's first blockbuster movie. It debuts, it makes millions and millions of dollars. Everybody in America goes out to see it. This is basically a fictionalized story presenting the Klan of the 1800s as really like a team of costumed heroes out defending the country against the quote-unquote threat of the newly freed African Americans. This is such a big hit that people start cosplaying Klansmen. They would have these parties in New York and in Los Angeles where people would come up dressed in white robes and hoods, and they would just party all night. It was kind of a crazy thing. And it also led to what's called the second era of the Klan. This was a Klan revival. Millions of people started joining the Klan all over America. And the Klan wanted to expand. In the second era, they wanted to expand into communities that didn't have large African American or Chinese immigrant populations. So their strategy was to expand the circle of hate. In this second era of the Klan, they didn't just hate African Americans and Chinese immigrants, they hated Asians of all kinds, they hated Middle Easterners, they hated Mexicans, South Americans, they hated Jews and Catholics. My guess is regardless of what you look like, if you look in your family tree, there are going to be a few people who this second era of the Klan did not like. This strategy totally worked. At its height, in the 1920s, the Klan had millions and millions of dues-paying members. Again, a revival of a hate organization because of the power of a single story. So let's fast forward to 1938. 1938, Superman debuts in the pages of Action Comics #1. And Superman is one of the few characters that is powerful enough and popular enough to kickstart his own genre. Superman is the very first superhero ever. So if you're a superhero fan, regardless of who you like, whether it's Spider-Man or Wonder Woman or Batman, all of those characters in some ways are just derivatives of Superman. Superman was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. They're two essentially kids living in Cleveland, Ohio. And they're both the children of Jewish immigrants from Europe. Now, I don't know if they meant to do this. I don't know if they did this consciously or not, but they definitely put pieces of their own cultural experience into the story that they're telling. I'm going to give you just one example of this. So the central reality of Superman's life is that he has to live in between these two different identities, right? He basically has to live between two cultures. He's an American, but he's also a Kryptonian. And in order to get through his daily life, he has to hide this fact from the people around him. Most of the time, most people seeing him walk down the streets of Metropolis think he's just a quote-unquote average American, but deep down inside, he knows he's not. Deep down inside, he knows he's an alien, that he's a foreigner, that he's basically an immigrant. And just to get through that daily life, he has to hide this fact from the people around him. This was essentially the daily reality of Siegel and Shuster and all of their Jewish friends and family, both here in the United States and especially in Europe. Remember, just as Superman was getting started in the 1930s, so was World War II. At the very beginning of the war, America, I'm sure you all know this from your high school history classes as well. At the very beginning of the war, America tried to stay neutral. This all ended when Pearl Harbor was attacked at the end of 1941. And within just a few days, America has declared war on all three Axis powers. They've entered the war. We have entered the war. And what we did was we sent troops overseas to fight this racist regime, to fight the Nazis. But we sent over an army that was segregated by race. This particular hypocrisy really grated on a lot of Americans. And about a month after America enters the war, an African American by the name of James G. Thompson writes a letter into a newspaper, and he proposes this idea. He says that when America goes overseas to fight in World War II, we ought to be fighting for two different victories. We ought to be fighting against the Axis, for victory over the Axis, and then we also ought to be fighting for victory over bigotry at home. This idea of the double victory really takes hold, and a lot of Americans, especially Americans of color, enlist in record numbers. They go overseas in the hopes of this double victory. During the war years, Superman fights a lot of Nazis. He does this both in his comic and on his radio show. And over the war years, he really develops into this American icon. He becomes a symbol of what America can be, what America really ought to be. The war ends in 1945. After the war ends, America realizes that we have learned a very important lesson, right? All of these reports start coming out about the Holocaust, and we realize the extent of what the Nazis actually did. And I think from the very beginning of America, there's always been this debate. There's been this debate between, on one side, it's all humans are created equal. On the other side, it's this particular kind of human is only 3/5 of a human. That debate, I think, was definitively settled in World War II. America realized that, in part because of all of the technologies that humankind had created, including communication technology, travel technology, and military technology, if we did not figure out how to live peacefully with people who don't look like us, with people who are different from us, that the world would actually burn. So after these American veterans came back, I think there was this real push for a true double victory. In 1948, President Truman signs into law the Executive Order 9981, which desegregates the military. This is a firm step towards that double victory. Not everybody is happy about this. 2 years before this, actually, this guy named Samuel Green, who looks suspiciously like President Truman for whatever reason. I don't know why. I showed this to my kids, and they're like, is that the same guy? This is not the same guy. Okay, this is not the same guy. Samuel Green was a grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, he'd been involved in the Klan since the 1920s. He actually saw the Klan collapse. He saw the end of the second era of the Klan. There's a bunch of internal corruption. One of the Klan leaders was convicted of murder, another one was convicted of larceny. The whole thing just kind of collapsed. And he really wanted to kickstart a third era of the Klan. So he, in May of 1946, he leads a group of men up Stone Mountain just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And they set to fire this giant wooden cross. It's his way of announcing to the world the Klan is back on its feet. And he invited all the media to cover this event. These pictures are actually from a 3-page spread in Life magazine. This was one of the most popular magazines at the time. So all the world knew the Klan was about to get back on its feet. The third era of the Klan was about to get started. So the second era of the Klan was created by a story, was kickstarted by a story. The third era of the Klan would end up being stifled by a story. And it would end up being stifled by this story about a man who wears a red cape. During the war years, Superman fought all these Nazis on his radio show. When the Nazis were defeated in real life, the radio show writers realized that he couldn't keep fighting Nazis on the radio. So they started looking around. Who was a threat to peace in post-World War II America? Somebody, nobody knows who, but somebody landed on the idea of using the Ku Klux Klan as the next antagonist. And there was a lot of debate about this because there was a risk involved. In many parts of America at the time, the Klan was seen not as a terrorist organization, but as a community organization. In the end, though, the writers' room made the brave choice, and they did it. Like I said earlier, in June of 1946, the first episode of the Klan of the Fiery Cross storyline debuts on the radio. A lot of the hate that the writers' room was worried about actually did manifest after that episode debuted. The New Jersey Klan actually issued a death threat against the writers' room of the Superman radio show. There were calls for boycotts in Atlanta. But really, the show was this huge hit. Listenership ended up soaring, and children all over America really embraced this storyline. This storyline also dealt this real-world blow against the real-life Ku Klux Klan. Supposedly, after hearing Klansmen being depicted as these bumbling, hateful bigots on this children's radio show, nobody in America could respect them like they did before the radio show debuted. So membership dropped, and for a while, for a decade or two, the Klan was very quiet, in part because of Superman. Ever since then, ever since 1946 at least, DC Comics has made their premier superhero not just a symbol of America, but a symbol of a particular kind of America, of a kind of America that isn't bound together, isn't united by history or blood, but it's united by a vision for the future, a multicultural America. It was a brave choice then. I think it's still kind of a brave choice now. All of this stuff that I found out a bunch more too. I put it in the back matter of the book. I hope you'll read it. Even though it doesn't have a lot of pictures in it, even though it's not panels. But all of it kind of informs our retelling of this very important Superman story. So I only did the writing. The drawing is done by this fantastic art team named Gurihur. They are a Japanese art studio. It's really just two women. One of them does all the pencils, the other one does all the inks and the colors, and they are absolutely fantastic. We kept all the bones of the story, so it's still set in 1946. All the major plot points are there. One of the big differences that we did introduce, though, is we made the daughter of the Chinese-American family that moves into Metropolis, that sets off all the action, we made her the central protagonist. In the original radio show, she is mentioned in a single line of dialogue. Her father mentions that she exists, and we never hear from her. We never even learn her name. In that Klan of the Fiery Cross storyline, Clark Kent tells Jimmy Olsen, he says, the Klan of the Fiery Cross is made up of intolerant bigots. They don't judge a man in the decent American way by his own qualities. They judge him by what church he goes to and by the color of his skin. With that statement, Clark Kent really was pointing our way towards a true double victory. If you look at the history of America from 1946 till now, unfortunately, I think you can agree with me that we have not achieved that true double victory. I have to say, recently, one of the impetuses of this particular project is I feel like we are kind of losing our faith in ourselves. We're losing this idea that we actually can live in peace with people who are different from us. And I think it's not just America. I think if you read about politics all over the world, in Europe, in Asia, in India, in the Philippines, you'll see the same idea pop up again and again and again. Superman, at least since 1946, has been the symbol that we can, in fact, live at peace with people who are different from us. And Superman Smashes the Klan really is Gurihur and my way of letting Superman express that one more time. Thank you very much again. Thank you.